Happy Independence Day from the Fox Valley Film Critics. In this special episode, we're going to be discussing a pair of patriotic films to celebrate the holiday. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the show brought to you by Groupthink Productions and FVTV. Joining us once again is Groupthink Productions executive producer and known extremist, Darrin.
I feel like your Yankee Doodle daddy today.
That's terrible.
I know it was, and I just thought of it, so I just thought I would throw that out there. So glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. So, wanted to celebrate the holiday today so we can have a good 4th of July. So we both brought our a patriotic film. So we're going to start with yours.
Thank you. So my film is Glory, 1990 movie. Matthew Broderick was the lead actor, but certainly he was really part of a very much an ensemble cast between Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, and it is the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first what we call today African-American regiment raised during the Civil War, and it very much mirrors the events that took place during that awful conflict.
Okay, I've seen this before. It's very, very good Civil War movie. There aren't that many Civil War movies, really.
I was just thinking about that as we were getting ready to do this, and so Audie Murphy did Red Badge of Courage. Certainly, a few years after this was released, there was the motion picture version of the book The Killer Angels called Gettysburg, so it would be a little more straightforward from the audience perspective. But in terms of Civil War movies, I was absolutely agreeing with you there. And a matter of fact, one of the films that you had me on earlier to talk about many weeks ago was that of The General.
Yes.
Which is a Civil War themed movie, and one of the items that the late great Orson Welles talked about at the time was the fact that he felt that The General had one of the most amazing fight sequences involving Civil War soldiers ever captured on film. Of course, he never got to see Glory.
Well, yes. I don't know if I would say the final scene in Glory is necessarily as good as the final scene in The General, but...
Well, there's not trains blowing up in the middle of a river, but certainly there's a lot of good stuff going on. And what was interesting to do as far as some research is the fact that there were a number of historical inaccuracies that were kind of put into this film that don't necessarily take away, but it's kind of interesting to see that perspective. So at the beginning of the motion picture, it's the Battle of Antietam, or as some people might reference as Sharpsburg, but that's not important right now. And what was curious to find out is that that sequence wasn't really an Antietam recreation. It was actually a Gettysburg recreation that they filmed to just kind of put that and try to pass it off as Antietam. And for the most part, well, until I didn't know the difference. What was also fascinating about that opening sequence was that many years ago on Chicago radio, there was a movie review show called Drive-In Reviews, and they talked about the movie Glory, and one of the key things about Drive-In Reviews was talking about, are there any quality kills to bring you into this motion picture? And so they mentioned me getting the movie Glory, the way that essentially one of the commanding officers disintegrates on camera during the battle was definitely a quality kill to start that motion picture. But essentially that's the beginning of things. Because of Antietam, President Lincoln was able to do the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed for the creation of units such as the 54th Massachusetts and later on others. And matter of fact, before the end of the war, I believe it was almost 200,000 African-American soldiers signed up and served, but it's because of those brave men that were captured in this movie that it all got started.
What year does this take place?
So what was interesting to see is that the motion picture said, or excuse me, the kind of some of the critique of the historical inaccuracies. The regiment historically was raised in 1863, so right smack dab in the middle of the war. Okay, but the way the movie puts it, it was actually the raising of the regiment actually took place in late 1862. But again, from that perspective, it's not that significant, and certainly that's really the arc of the film: the creation of the unit, the training of the unit, and then ultimately when it's sent off for its most significant battle.
Which ends very badly.
Yes. And really in terms of the battle itself, and another historical inaccuracy they talked about was that most of the soldiers that made up the 54th Massachusetts were actually freedmen.
Interesting.
That in the motion picture, whether it be Denzel Washington's character, whether it be Morgan Freeman's character, these were essentially runaway slaves that made up the vast majority of the unit, when in fact that wasn't the case at all. Not that it matters enormously, but it was an interesting different take as far as how they chose to populate the regiment.
Okay, I'm assuming that was more of an artistic choice.
Yes.
So,
Mm-hmm.
giving people who were slaves themselves a chance to kind of avenge. So.
And certainly that's a big part of it, because you think about the dangers that were going on here. If going back to a more modern motion picture, Lincoln, just out a few years ago.
Yes.
Steven Spielberg. It starts. The motion picture starts by showing a regiment just like the 54th Massachusetts was in the process of being overrun by a Confederate unit, and because of the presence of the African American soldiers, there was no quarter given. And all those soldiers were basically either slaughtered, or if any were captured, they were immediately put back into slavery. So when we think about what individuals such as those in the 54th Massachusetts did, that's really what they were looking at. And they fully understood that when they went off to battle, either they were victorious, they were going to die, or they were potentially subjecting themselves to be, if captured, to be put back into slavery. So yes, and so it is an amazing story of heroism that those individuals put forth, and all the while that even though here are individuals that are risking their lives, that are facing those three choices, still the federal government chose to do a couple of different things. One, pay them less than the other normal regiments. So regular Army soldiers were paid $13 a month. They got paid $10. Exactly. And there was a famous scene during that middle of the film where they realized what was going on and basically refusing to take pay. Two, they not only were they paid less, they were basically not being allowed to be promoted into the officer ranks, and so the Army demanded, and would have the same rules in place until the late 1940s when President Truman changed it, that there would be no integration, and at least during the Civil War there were no African American officers that were allowed, although, as we see in the film, Morgan Freeman's character is ultimately promoted to Sergeant Major, which was essentially the highest ranking enlisted rank possible in that film.
Okay, I can see why there aren't a lot of Civil War films. It's not a happy period.
No, it's not, and it's even more so is the fact that given 1860s, the population of the United States, whether between the states that were there, that was counting California or not as many people, but it's still the fact that the Civil War, more soldiers died north and south than all other conflicts in United States history. And the effect that it had, the way that oftentimes these regiments were raised, maybe came from a specific county or a specific town. And so when that regiment went into battle, particularly if it's a small town, small community, and it got into a pretty bad fight, suddenly all the men in that particular area are just gone, are dead, are maimed, and it was pretty awful stuff. Ken Burns' documentary. We were just talking about Ken Burns a little bit before, a moment ago. In the aftermath of the Civil War, there were states that a pretty significant portion of that state budget was set aside for creating prosthetics for Civil War soldiers. So it was a pretty significant event, and for the soldiers to do what they did, and this was the first, what they ended up doing, being sent into battle, and really was a horrific situation where they were sent off into the Carolinas to try and close the port of why can't I think, to close off one of the southern ports. And in terms of doing so, they had to take Fort Wagner in order to allow the process of taking that town, shutting that port down, because if you shut the ports down, well, the South couldn't get supplies that they needed from whether it be from Europe or from where they're trying to get their supplies. And this attack, and ultimately that's how the film ends, the lead up to that event. It was just, the soldiers knew what they were up against. The commander, played by Matthew Broderick, understood that he was subjecting this regiment that he helped oversee and create and to train, that a good chunk of those soldiers were not going to make it back. But they took that on, and more importantly, they did it willingly and heroically in terms of the attack that ends the film.
Yeah, and Broderick doesn't make it either.
Spoiler. No. And again, spoiler alert on a
historical event.
Exactly, on a motion picture. So the final battle itself was just a sequence after another. The battle starts near dusk, immediately bogs down. They wait until dark, where they hope to have maybe can confuse the Confederates, and the amazing sequence of these star shells going over and the firing going on. And this is one of the reasons, I'm sure, this battle sequence is why Glory won 3 Academy Awards, one of which was for cinematography, one was for sound, and one was for Denzel Washington's character, which really catapulted him into movie stardom. And certainly his career took off from that point, but that was a pretty important role for him. And certainly as we think about that battle and as it took place, that the way the motion picture ends, again, it's history. So the regiment, they led the attack, they suffered almost 50% casualties, and the commander, Robert Goodshaw, Matthew Broderick's character, was killed during the attack. And as we think about what the war was trying to create, what those soldiers were fighting for was for equality, and ultimately, in death, all those soldiers, including Robert Goodshaw, were thrown into a common grave. And it's kind of a bit of a metaphor.
That's all the time we have for this segment. Join us for the following segment, where we'll be moving from the sublime to the ridiculous and discussing Team America, World Police. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to the show. So you had a wonderful discussion. You're able to bring up all these wonderful points about how Glory is an amazing movie about the fight for equality and the importance of sacrifice in the face of evil. And now we're going to talk about the South.
Exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. The fight for freedom, the fight for overcoming injustice and evil in the world, and maybe
destroying everything good in the process.
And maybe an opportunity to talk about North Korean leaders singing.
Sublime to the ridiculous, as they say.
Yes.
So this was an early 2000s movie. Obviously, it's tempered by the fact that it's clearly kind of aping off of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and it's playing up the whole isolationism versus interventionalism argument, probably in the most middle of the road way humanly possible. Which, I mean, it's no secret that I'm a fan of South Park. And the thing about the South Park guys is that they are raging libertarians, and they have this really weird way of taking a middle of the road stance while making every side look dumb in the process.
Well, what I was gonna say as well is that Matt Stone, Trey
Parker,
thank you, Trey Parker, are really known for their cinematography or cinematic rather subtlety. So you can see that over and over and over again in the motion picture. That the very opening sequence where they knock down, the Team America knocks down runs into the Arc de Triomphe, knocks down the Eiffel Tower, and one of the characters talks about, "Take that, terrorist!" while putting a load of buckshot in the man's chest, or in the puppet's or the marionette's chest, as the case may be.
Okay, let's back up a little bit on this. So, as I'm aware, this film was originally pitched as an all-marionette remake of Armageddon.
They want to do a line-by-line, scene-by-scene recreation of Armageddon with the justification, did you look at the movie? Did you see all the wooden performances? How are our marionettes going to be any different?
I can only imagine why this pitch wasn't accepted.
I don't know why. And so they
didn't want to embarrass then popular director Michael Bay, which they then immediately turn around and write an entire song in the film about why Pearl Harbor sucks.
And I think most stirring moments of the motion picture is when the character.
I would never use the word stirring in this. But
working on it. He's an actor, and they need an actor a world-class actor to go overseas to join Team America because one of their individuals died in the Paris attack. And as they're trying to convince the actor, flies to Washington, D.C. and is having a stirring moment in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which is hysterical because they have this little puppet next to this chain fence, and the puppet is right there. You can tell it's only 2 feet high, 2.5 feet high. But then looking up at the statue of President Lincoln and drawing the appropriate sense of awe from that particular moment. And again, freedom isn't free. It's $1.05.
So obviously this is coming straight off of the early South Park days when the bigger, longer uncut. So Trey Parker and Matt Stone, they're big musical guys, and they just write musical numbers into everything because they can.
Because they can. So that song's there. Well, the beginning was the takeoff of the musical Rent, which they did.
Everyone has AIDS.
Well, they did Lease. I wasn't going to go there, and
that song is amazing.
So they did that. They did Freedom Isn't Free. They did the song sung by the now dead North Korean leader. I'm So Lonely. I'm not going to say it like he did.
I'm not going to either for obvious reasons.
Right. And those are the songs that I remember, but there may have been more. And I'm just not coming up with them at the moment. Now, certainly, it was really taking a look at, as you mentioned, it was both sides. So not only did you see the gratuitous use of American firepower overseas, but also was coming back and really putting back on the characters that we saw in Hollywood. Would be Alec Baldwin, whether it be Matt Damon,
Michael Moore.
Michael Moore, exactly. putting it on them and ridiculing them just as much as ridiculing overseas adventurism during the time.
Yeah, and of course the film's most profound speech being the, I'm not going to repeat what our main character says during this speech, because he literally lifts it off of a guy at a bar who's screaming obscenities at him.
Yes.
It reminds me of the great P.G. O'Rourke chapter where he talks about how talk radio sounds exactly like someone screaming at you. And all talk radio discussion is basically on par with the guy at the bar screaming obscenities and throwing beer bottles at the TV. But he is inspired by this speech. He takes it in front of the Film Actors Guild, which is an amazing acronym, and he does this whole speech about why you have to fight the bad guys, even though the good guys are making themselves look bad in the process by destroying everything.
Right.
And it just ends up being this elaborate defense of why Team America is justified despite their gratuitous destruction of the free world. And it's such a fascinating and weird perspective on war fighting in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So
yeah, now here we are. What?
It's basically the same theme as The Dark Knight, but
yeah,
done much cruder.
we're 13 years removed from Team America, essentially, and you know, it is an interesting perspective, something that was that close to that event and why it was there, and how we got to be where we're at today.
I mean, now everyone is basically isolationist, no matter what side you're on. So it's now this film feels incredibly out of the conversation now, but.
Absolutely. So that, and just one of the most, speaking of gratuitous, one of the most gratuitous scenes involving puppet marionettes.
No.
And again, we're not going to get into detail, but again, just a whole lot of wrong.
Everything in this movie is clearly, it's taking like the most gratuitous action movie or anything movie you'd ever seen, and it's turning it up to 11. Just for the sake of doing it.
Right, which is what they do, which is what Matt and Trey do.
Yeah, that scene in particular, oh my gosh, what a nightmare. This is not what I expected to see out of this movie.
No. The only redeeming feature, if you're going to say that, is that the two of them never did another marionette movie. Apparently, it was horrifically over budget. It cost the studio head their job.
Really?
Because it simply did not do very well. It was like that studio had one major bust after another, and this was such, it simply did not recoup money particularly well at the box office.
Was it just because of the budget? Because I thought this movie did all right.
Yeah, my understanding is this film was essentially went over. Excuse me. Start again. This was another in a sequence of disappointing films from that studio, and because of that, they said, "We're done. Thank you for your service."
That's an excellent note to go.
Go away. We're done.
Yeah, I mean that can't look good on your record. It's just like, I mean, saying you worked on Team America is one thing, but. Having that be the swan song of your studio, I mean, just like, what happened to your studio? Well, we were making a marionette movie. It went over budget, and the studio shut down.
Well, the studio kept going, but they fired the studio head.
Oh, okay. But that would not look good as the last credit on your thing.
No.
This is like one of those things you fold into your other credits. This is like, what did you work on? A couple art films, Team America, a couple more films. What was that middle one?
Team America. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I love that movie. You're never going to work in this town again.
Which, fortunately for those two in South Park, they had a day job and they were able to go back to it. And
those guys are like invincible, aren't they?
Well, it helps when you have the day job and you can have those events and you can still keep going because you can keep producing what you're doing on a ongoing basis.
How do they have the ability to get away with everything they've done? Like all of the stuff that any other team would ever do that would get them thrown out of Hollywood, and they just get away with it casually? Is it just because no one takes them seriously? Is it because everyone kind of gets their shtick and no one thinks they're actually being like bigoted or insensitive or?
Well, no, I think they are being bigoted and being insensitive, but I think it's a matter of all of the above, that they've been doing it long enough and they've reached a point where their sponsors, the folks that are paying the bills, know what they're getting, and they're able to do what they want to. And it all started because they were using crepe paper to create animation.
And they turned it into the most successful animated show on the planet.
Yes, they did. Which comes back to the original theme, which is Happy Birthday, America.
Oh. Show's not over yet.
I know, but I was kind of hoping that was the case because it would have been a perfect fade to black, but that's okay. But one of the fascinating things in the film, though, is the sheer number of world locations they managed to destroy or impact, even on a small scale, because we didn't even talk about the destruction of the Panama Canal.
That one's just a brutal scene. That one's not even played for comedy.
Right. Destroyed that. Certainly we saw the destruction of Paris. Didn't even get to the conversation where they destroyed the Sphinx.
They destroy most of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. So antiquities from ancient Egypt were destroyed, and we now know the danger of having the cutout signal being because obviously it's not being picked up from very far away from the next car.
Nothing beats I think the best scenes in this film are always the ones where they revert back to the fact that they're clearly marionettes. So they set up that the two actors are gonna do like this incredible martial arts scene, and then they just start tumbling together and just doing this. That's all the time we have for this show. Thank you very much for joining us for the Independence Day episode. Happy 4th of July, America. Yeah, you can follow the show on YouTube at the Groupthink Productions, or you can find past recordings of the show. You can follow me on Twitter at AntisocialCriti, that's critic with the C at the end, and you can find more written reviews that I've done at Geeks Under Grace and the antisocialcritic.tumblr.com. I'm Tyler with the Fox Valley Film Critics. Happy Independence Day, everyone.
Hello? Great news. I found us an audition.
Morning, Gloria.
Wait, you got what? I found us a posting for an audition for this really cool sounding indie drama being made by this eccentric, outsider, artistic type.
You did? Where'd you find it?
Craigslist? Look, it'll be fine. I've done gigs like this before. We shoot in a few weeks. You'll get a shot at a big role to show off to the casting guys, and I'll get the cash I need to stay in town for another month, okay?